in support of Senator Kane's War Powers Resolution to make crystal clear that, as required by the Constitution of the United States, the President may not take offensive military action against Iran or any other country without congressional approval. Last Saturday, the world learned through a social media post by Donald Trump that he had ordered an attack on 3 of Iran's nuclear enrichment sites, the first ever direct U.S. military assault on Iranian territory. We all agree that Iran must not obtain a nuclear weapon, but bombing is not the best, most sustainable way of achieving that goal, and nothing I heard yesterday at the intelligence briefing changes that assessment. The bombing attack was also a clear violation of the U.S. Constitution, which reserves to the Congress the power to declare war. And make no mistake, initiating a bombing attack against another country is not only a matter of foreign policy, it is an act of war. For anyone who claims otherwise, I ask them to consider this. What would we have said if Iran or any other country had flown bombers over our country and struck our facilities? We would rightly call it what it was, an act of war. While the President has the authority to defend the United States when attacked, Article 1 of the Constitution vests the responsibility to go to war explicitly and exclusively in the Congress, not in one person in the Oval Office. James Madison put it best in 1793 when he wrote, and I quote, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive. The trust and temptation would be too great for any one man," unquote. That's why the framers of the Constitution designed a system of checks and balances to stop the government from ignoring the will of the American people. And the American people absolutely do not want the United States to be dragged into more unnecessary wars. So, Madam President, beyond the debate over the particular politics or policy of President Trump's decision to attack Iran, this debate is about the rule of law. And no president, past, present, or future, is above the law. Those strikes violated American law, and prominent legal experts have said they also violated international law. The fact that there is now a ceasefire in place does not obviate the need to pass this resolution. President Trump has already shown that he is willing to initiate hostilities on his own. And indeed, as Senator Kane just mentioned, President Trump just said a few hours ago that he would, quote, absolutely consider bombing Iran again. And just last month, when asked whether he needs to uphold the Constitution of the United States, President Trump answered, quote, "I don't know." We, the United States Senate and House, should make clear that compliance with our Constitution is not optional. Now, President Trump did not just attack another country in violation of the Constitution. He did so in spite of facts presented by our own U.S. intelligence agencies. Just 3 months ago, the U.S. intelligence community noted that, and I quote, "They continue to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003, unquote. That assessment has been reaffirmed year after year since at least 2007, that Iran was not producing a nuclear weapon and had not made a decision to do so. You would think that the facts and intelligence assessments would matter when a president chooses to attack another country. Apparently not in this case. Indeed, when President Trump was confronted with the U.S. intelligence community's assessment just days before he launched the attack, he dismissed it. It was an inconvenient fact. It was inconvenient because it showed there was more time for diplomacy to work, time to get a negotiated solution. Secretary Rubio was asked about this intelligence assessment after the United States bombed Iran. His answer, very revealing. He said, and I quote, "Forget about the intelligence," unquote, and then went on to try to justify the timing of the attack. Now, as I said earlier, most, if not all of us, agree that Iran must not have a nuclear weapon, which would pose an existential threat to Israel, threaten America's interests in the region by further emboldening Iran's malign actions, and increase the risk of nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East. So the question is, how do we best accomplish that goal in a durable way that doesn't unleash unintended consequences and put Americans and others at greater risk? President Obama answered that question. That's exactly what he accomplished through the agreement his administration negotiated with Iran 10 years ago this July. President Obama made a deal with Iran to prevent it from building a nuclear weapon. And the agreement was working. Iran was subject to around-the-clock, 24-hour inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency. That agreement made the whole world a safer place. But in his very first term, Donald Trump ripped up that deal. Not surprisingly, Iran began to enrich uranium at higher levels, though still not at the 90% level needed for bomb-grade material. Now, by the time Donald Trump returned to the White House this year, even he and his administration had come to understand that the best way to ensure that Iran does not decide to develop a nuclear weapon is through negotiation. That's why earlier this year, he dispatched his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to open negotiations with Iran. And those negotiations were ongoing. Indeed, the sixth round of discussions were scheduled to take place on Sunday, June 15th, just 2 days before the Netanyahu government launched its attacks on Iran. Not surprisingly, that Israeli attack derailed the ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations. It is important to remember that a decade earlier, Prime Minister Netanyahu worked very hard to derail President Obama's ongoing negotiations with Iran. Indeed, Prime Minister Netanyahu even addressed a joint session of Congress, urging the Congress not to proceed with those negotiations. Prime Minister Netanyahu did not succeed in derailing President Obama's JCPOA negotiations. That agreement went into effect, and it did make the world and our country and Israel a safer place. But unlike then, Prime Minister Netanyahu succeeded this time. He outmaneuvered Donald Trump. That story is well documented in a June 17th New York Times piece entitled, and I quote, "How Trump Shifted on Iran Under Pressure from Israel," unquote, and a June 23 Washington Post story entitled, and I quote, "Netanyahu decided on Iran war last year and then sought to recruit Trump," unquote. Simply put, Prime Minister Netanyahu accomplished that goal. President Trump joined his war of choice against Iran. And in doing so, President Trump put our men and women in uniform in the region in grave danger and unnecessary risk. Following the attack, Iran fired 14 missiles at a major U.S. airbase in Qatar. Fortunately, Iran gave the United States and Qatar advance warning, and there were no casualties. but the full extent of Iranian retaliation could play out throughout the region and other places around the world over a long period of time. And what was accomplished? What was accomplished? To hear President Trump tell it, the Iranian nuclear program was, quote, obliterated, unquote. That is flat out untrue. Untrue. We know from public reporting that a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment found that the strikes only set back Iran's nuclear program by a few months. Whether it's a few months or somewhat longer, the point is this: the strikes did not obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Before the attacks, U.S. intelligence assessed that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and in the aftermath of the attacks, Iran may well change its mind and move forward. So President Trump disregarded politically inconvenient U.S. intelligence assessment when he launched the attacks, and he's now making up his own politically convenient narrative about the results. What's been particularly cowardly is the Trump administration's efforts to escape their own failures by hiding behind the amazing men and women of the U.S. military. To hear President Trump and Secretary of Defense Hesketh tell it, any criticism of their decision to attack Iran is somehow a criticism of the American military. This is garbage, and they know it. Our servicemen and women performed their mission flawlessly, and they did it with courage and with resolve. It's especially rich to see Donald Trump, who so often insulted and belittled our military heroes, now try to hide his own failings behind them. So let's be clear. While we owe our service members our debt of gratitude, we do not owe that debt of gratitude to President Trump or members of his cabinet for their decisions or for their current efforts to manipulate the narrative about the results of the attack. I have to say, as my colleague Senator Kaine mentioned, that the spectacle of President Trump and Secretary Hesketh berating the press for questioning their claims that the Iranian nuclear program had been, quote, obliterated only reveals their manic desperation to hide the truth. Remember when President George Bush declared with respect to Iraq, mission accomplished? What President Trump and Secretary Hesketh are communicating is that it's somehow treasonous to ask about intelligence reporting that casts doubts on their claims. This is not only an effort to intimidate and silence the press, it also sends a terrible message to all the intelligence analysts in the U.S. government. It says that anybody who presents facts that don't fit President Trump's political narrative is trying to, as Secretary Hesketh said, make the president look bad, or undermining the success of our pilots, or trying to manipulate the public mind. That's ridiculous. We've already seen, Madam President, the dangers of manipulating intelligence to fit the president's narrative rather than fidelity to the facts. The United States went to war in Iraq under false pretenses. Remember when the Bush administration told America that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction? Remember when Vice President Cheney warned in March 2003 that, quote, if there's a mushroom cloud in New York, you will know that Saddam Hussein is behind it, unquote. And of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So false intelligence and false narratives that fan the flames of unnecessary wars cost us dearly. The Iraq War cost the lives of over 4,000 American soldiers, hundreds of billions of dollars of American taxpayer money. The war upended the region, killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, strengthened Iran, and unleashed ISIS on the world. It was the worst U.S. foreign policy blunder in a generation. Madam President, the Trump administration has now created a culture of fear and retribution throughout the federal government. We've already seen patriotic federal employees be fired for telling the truth. Whistleblower just filed a complaint the other day. He'd been at the Justice Department. He said, "I didn't sign up to lie." So the real challenge is this. The president has not obliterated the Iran nuclear program, but he is doing everything he can to obliterate the credibility of the U.S. intelligence community so he can invent his own reality without contradiction. That's why it's more important than ever that Congress stand up for the Constitution and insist that the president cannot initiate hostilities without approval from Congress. That's what this resolution asks. It asks, do you support the Constitution and the role it gives the Congress to declare war? Do you believe that the people's representatives should have a voice in whether American lives, and specifically the lives of our nation's armed forces, are put at grave risk? We owe it to our troops, we owe it to the American people to ensure that no president, not this president or any other, can unilaterally commit our nation to go to war. The Constitution does entrust that responsibility to us. Let's not abdicate it. Colleagues, I urge you to vote yes on the Kane War Powers resolution, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from California.